The next thing I'd like to tackle with this component is making it work well with the keyboard. So currently, if we actually focus this element, we can hit spacebar to open it, which is pretty nice, and we just get that for free because we decided to use a real button here. So even though we're only listening for a click event, the browser is going to simulate a click event on space on focusable elements. So at least we're off to a pretty good start there. The next thing I'd like to do is get it closing when the user hits escape though, kind of like we did with our modal example earlier. Now there's two ways that we could do it in this case. We could add an event listener to the whole document, listening for escape key presses and closing the dropdown if it's open. But in this case, because whenever the component is open, this input field is focused, we can also very easily just add the escape key listener to that input field. So since that's a lot simpler, I think that's the approach that we should go with, at least for now. So let's add a key down listener to this input that's listening for the escape key, and whenever someone presses escape, let's call our close method that we wrote earlier down here. So now we should be able to open this field, hit escape, and see it close. Next, let's work on making it possible for the user to navigate these options using the up and down arrow keys. So we're going to want to be able to show them a currently highlighted item somehow, and I think we're going to need to keep track of that in state somewhere. So why don't we start by sort of setting that up. So I'm going to head over to the data section of this component, and I'm going to add a new property here called highlighted index, which is going to represent the currently highlighted item in the list. And why don't we just default it to 0, so by default it highlights the first item in the list. Now if we want to actually highlight that item in the template, we can head up here to our actual template section and we can just check to see when we're iterating over all these items, if this item is the currently highlighted one, we can add an extra class to it to highlight it. So we can get the index of the current item here by grabbing the index from v4. So here we're getting the actual option, and here we're getting the index of that option. So now up here where we have our class stuff set up, we can add a dynamic class binding as well, where we just say that we want to add the isActive class to this element as long as I is equal to the current highlighted index. So now if I open this component, we should see that the first item is highlighted. We can't actually change this, so if I hit up and down, nothing happens. So why don't we work on making it possible for me to hit the down arrow key and have the next item in the list become highlighted. So to get started, let's add another key down listener to this input field, since this field is what's going to have focus when we're trying to interact with that list. So let's add a key down to listen for the down arrow key, and we'll just have that call a method. Why don't we call it something like highlight next to highlight the next item in the list. Let's jump down to the bottom of this file and add that as a method. So let's add a highlight next method, and a very simple sort of naive implementation of this could just be something like this dot highlighted index equals this dot highlighted index plus 1. Let's head over to the browser and see if this is working. So if we open this up, if I hit down, well, it does look like it's selecting the next item. So that's a step in the right direction. Let's work on getting the up arrow key to work now. Okay, so similar to what we did with highlight next, let's add another listener here. Maybe we'll add an up listener, and we'll have this call highlight maybe prev. So we'll have highlight prev and highlight next. So let's head down to the bottom here and let's just duplicate highlight next and change the name and update the implementation. So if we have highlight prev, just subtract 1 from the currently highlighted index. Well, this should at least be a step in the right direction. So let's refresh the browser. If we open this list, I can hit down and it moves down the list, and if I hit up, it moves up the list. But what if I'm on the first item and I hit up again? Well, now the highlighted index is going to be -1, which is probably not what we want. I think a better behavior here would be to wrap and jump to the last item in the list. So let's try and get that working. So here in highlight prev, where we're highlighting the previous item, let's just go ahead and update the highlighted index to be the current index -1, but then let's add a conditional at the end to check if we went outside of our boundaries, reset it to some sane value. So we can say something like if this dot highlighted index is less than 0, so if we have a negative index, well then we want to force highlighted index to be some other value. So I think we want to update highlighted index to be the last item in the list, right? Now we want it to be the last item in the filtered list, not the full list, because we only want to highlight things that are actually visible. So we can do that by setting it to this dot filtered options dot length, and then -1 since arrays are 0 indexed. Let's head over to the browser and refresh and just open this in the dev tools so we can make sure that this state is actually updating properly. So if I hit down, highlighted index is moving to 1, 2, 3. If I hit up when I'm on the first item, it jumps back to 12, so that's good. However, you can see that the currently highlighted item is not visible on screen. If we scroll all the way down here, you can see, yep, here it is at the bottom, but it doesn't immediately jump into view when we navigate to it with the keyboard. So how can we get this to actually scroll into place so we can actually see it? Well, it turns out the browser has a pretty nice API for doing this, at least in modern browsers, so I'll show you how that works. So let's head over to Highlight Prev here. So all we need to do is, if we have a reference to the current element, the element that we want to be able to see, we just need to say element.scroll into view, and the browser is going to automatically make sure that it's visible. Okay, so how can we get a reference to the currently selected DOM element? Well, if we scroll up to the template, your first instinct might be to add a ref to the actual LI. We could do something like ref equals option. And now what Vue will do if you add a ref to an element with a v4 is it'll make the ref an array. So we'll have one ref for every item. Now this sounds like it would work, but it turns out Vue actually doesn't guarantee that the refs array is in the same order as your actual options. So especially when you're doing things like filtering and removing things from the DOM and adding them back to the DOM, it's very easy for the order of the refs array and your actual options order to get out of sync. So if we try and access a ref by index, it might not give us back the correct DOM element. Thankfully, there's an easy way to get around this. Instead of adding a ref to the actual LIs themselves, we can add a ref to the actual list, and we can just access the children of the list by their index. So if we give this a ref of, say, options, now down here in the script section, we can grab the highlighted element through this $refs.options.children, and then we just need to grab the child that matches the highlighted index. So we can just say this highlighted index, and then we can call scroll into view on that DOM node. So if we go ahead and refresh here, we should see that if I hit up, we jump to the end of the list, and it's actually in view, which is pretty nice. So I can keep hitting up, and it'll keep scrolling as we go. So that's pretty slick. We do have to make the same changes to down, though. So you can see when I hit down, eventually we scroll off screen, and the currently selected item isn't in view. We also need to deal with the same wrapping problem when we're incrementing the highlighted index as we did when we were decrementing it when we were moving to the previous item. So I think if you get to the last item in the list and hit down to go to the next one, it should wrap back to the beginning. So let's just copy this conditional and paste it in here for now and make a couple tweaks. So instead of checking if the highlighted index is greater than 0, let's check if the highlighted index is greater than this .filteredOptions.length minus 1. So if it's greater than the last element in the list. Now instead of setting the highlighted index to the last item, we want to set it to the first item. So we can just set this to 0. We can also copy this line where we're doing that scrolling, paste that in, and now we should be able to see that everything is hopefully working. So if we refresh, I can hit down, things are scrolling. If I hit up, things are scrolling, so things are looking pretty good. Now, one thing I don't really love about this default implementation here is that by default, as we're hitting down, you can see that it's keeping the element at the very top. I'd prefer if it just scrolled in place, kind of like we see when we hit up, until it runs out of room. We can make this happen with an option that we pass to scroll into view. So instead of just calling scroll into view with no arguments, we can pass through an object where we say that the block that we want it to use is the nearest block. So if we go ahead and refresh now, we'll see that we do get that nice behavior where it only scrolls as necessary. So this feels pretty good. It feels kind of like a very native control at this point. We have a little bit of duplication here though, so why don't we try and extract a method to clean this up a little bit. Why don't we add a new method called highlight that just takes an index and worries about some of this duplicated logic for us. So maybe in highlight, what we'll do is we'll set the highlighted index to match the index that was passed in, and then maybe we'll move both of these conditionals inside this method. So it sort of checks both sides of our boundary. So if I paste both of these in here, we can also grab the scroll into view logic and paste that in here. And now with any luck, we should be able to simplify highlight prev and highlight next to just call this .highlight passing through the index that they're trying to highlight. So if we change this one to +1, we can delete all this stuff. And with any luck, if we refresh, things should still be working. And we should also be able to filter this list and still go up and down and have things work. So I can just go between these two items, or D, now I can go between these three. So it looks like everything is working pretty nicely. Okay, so we've got the up and down stuff working. What about actually making a selection? It'd be nice if I could hit up and down, find the item I want, and then hit enter to actually select that item. So why don't we work on getting that working? Since the actual input field where the user is typing their search is still what's focused when the user hits enter, we can add that key listener to this input. So we can say key down dot enter, and now we should also prevent the default behavior because if the user puts this in a form, we don't want enter submitting the form. So we'll call dot prevent here as well. And why don't we just call a method here like select highlighted? So select the currently highlighted item. Let's head down to the bottom here, and maybe underneath select, we'll add a new method called select highlighted. So this is going to be pretty simple. All we have to do is call this dot select, passing through the highlighted option. And we can get the highlighted option by calling this dot filtered options, and then grabbing the filtered option at the current highlighted index. Let's try it out and see if it works. So we'll refresh, hit down a few times, up a few times. Maybe we'll pick creator. If I hit enter, yeah, it's selected. Awesome. One thing you'll notice though is that if I go ahead and open this again, it's still scrolled down to that section. This isn't inherently bad, but I feel like it makes more sense to reset the highlighted index back to 0 whenever the user commits a selection. So how about in the select method, just like we're resetting search to an empty string, let's reset this highlighted index back to 0. Let's head over to the browser, refresh, and see what happens now. So now if I open it and I scroll down, scroll up, maybe I pick destruction here and hit enter. If I open it again, Anthrax is selected instead of destruction, which is the desired behavior. But look what happens if I select maybe Metallica, hit enter, and then open the dropdown again. It's scrolled just down to the middle where Metallica is visible, but we actually can't even see the highlighted index right now. So why don't we set it up such that whenever the user opens the control, we automatically scroll the options to make sure that the highlighted option is in view on open. So let's refresh here. Let's head over to where we have this open method, and how about right after we focus the search, we also scroll the options list to the currently selected item. So we could just copy this implementation here, but why don't we extract this to a method that we can call? So let's add a new method like scroll to highlighted. And now we can just copy this implementation here and move that up here. Now down here in highlight, we can just call this .scroll to highlighted instead of duplicating all that logic. And now we should be able to just take this method and paste that up underneath our focus call here. And with any luck, now whenever we open this control, it'll automatically scroll to the highlighted item. So if we open it, it shows the first item. If I scroll down and maybe I select Metallica again, now when I open it again, Anthrax is selected and we're scrolled back up to the top. Something else I think we need to look at here though is look what happens if I have, say, Exodus highlighted here, then I scroll Exodus out of view and click the button again. Exodus jumps back into view, which is maybe not too weird, but I don't think it's desired behavior. I feel like we shouldn't actually be sort of trying to set up the window if it's already open. So why don't we add a conditional to the top of open here where we say if this is open already, just return. Don't do any more setup work. Okay, there's one more thing related to keyboard control here that I want to look at, and that's that when we open this control, this field is highlighted, but if I hit tab, it moves us out of the dropdown and back to the button over here behind it that you can't really see. So what should happen when the user tabs away from this control? Well, I can think of two options. One is that we close the control, sort of like a cancel action, but if we close it, do we commit the selected item or do we discard it? It's sort of hard to say because tab is a pretty neutral action. It's not like escape, which feels like cancel, or enter, which feels like commit. So another option would be to actually trap the user's focus inside of this control. So if they try to hit tab, they wouldn't actually lose focus. Now this can actually be a bad practice in some cases because it can make keyboard navigation harder, but I think in this case it's fine because the user can still close this control by hitting escape, which I think is pretty intuitive. So in order to sort of focus trap that input, all we need to do is add another key down listener to the input where we listen for the tab key and just prevent the default behavior. We don't even have to map this to a method or anything. So now if I go and refresh, if I open the control, I can hit tab as much as I want and nothing will happen. But if I hit escape, I can cancel my current selection. And if I hit up or down and pick a selection, hit enter, well now it closes and commits that selection.